Good afternoon, pilot teachers, and good afternoon, students. Okay, thank you. Sit down. We've started on the new topic yesterday or in our last lesson, and the new topic that we've moved on to now is looking at denudation. Let's recap very quickly on what we have covered for the introduction or on the introduction on that new topic on denudation. Mason, we'll start with you. Can you define the word denudation for the class? Or what is denudation?
Denudation is the processes that wear down and lower the land surface.
Okay, thank you. We're looking at all those processes which help to lower and also to wear down the land surface. There are three important processes that we looked at briefly yesterday that comes under the topic on denudation. What are those three processes which are actually involved with denudation? Moses, what are the three processes of denudation?
Weathering, mesh washing, and erosion.
Okay, very good. We looked at weathering as one of those processes of denudation because it helps lower the land. Mass wasting, of which I mentioned that will be covered thoroughly in grade 12, so we are not going to touch on it in grade 11. And erosion, of which we will also look at when we look at river studies towards the end of this particular topic. Brendan, explain what weathering involves, or what is weathering?
Weathering is the process which break down rocks by mechanical, chemical, and biotic forces.
Okay, very good. In weathering, it is simply to do with the breaking down of rocks. And the rocks are broken down physically or mechanically, they are broken down chemically, and they are broken down biologically or biotically. So weathering refers to the breaking down of rocks. We also have the process of erosion. And what does erosion involve? Caleb, what is erosion or defined erosion?
The process by which rocks are worn down by moving agents, for example, water, wind, and ice.
Okay, good. We're looking at the process whereby the moving agents of water, wind, and ice, or what we call the agents of erosion, water, wind, and ice, aid in the movement, which is transportation. And while those materials are being transported or moved, they are further broken down. So in erosion, we can say erosion is weathering and transportation. In weathering, it is only the breaking down. There is no movement involved. And that is a difference that you should be able to pick up between erosion and weathering. Finally, we also looked at mass movement. And I mentioned it will be covered in more detail later. But with the brief information we had, Val, would you like to explain what mass movement involves in the process of denudation?
Mass movement includes particles are carried down slope.
Any other information to be included? Particles are carried down slope. Okay, under the force of gravity. Good. So we must also include that information on gravity because it has to do with mass wasting or mass movement. Okay, we move on. And referring now to the chart of which we had at least access to it yesterday and we had a chance to look at the chart. The chart here basically shows us those processes which are under denudation, rock weathering, mass movement, and erosion. And I also mentioned something about deposition. And I asked, why is it that deposition is actually not under the process of denudation? Because if we come back to our definition, denudation is to do with the lowering or the weighing down of the earth's surface. Whereas in deposition, deposition does not lower, rather it raises. Therefore, deposition is a process on its own. But we see it on this particular chart simply because all of those processes, when they are taking place, finally, the final stage will be the stage of deposition. But we do not include deposition as part of denudation. It is a process on its own. Okay, we've looked at weathering, mass wasting, and erosion. Already our students have defined those three processes. And our lesson yesterday saw us look at weathering in more detail. And we looked at weathering can be done physically, it can be biologically done, or it can be chemically done. And our work or our lesson yesterday looked at some examples of physical or mechanical weathering. And those examples that we looked at pressure release jointing as one of the examples under physical or mechanical weathering. We also looked at freezing and thawing. We looked at exfoliation or thermal expansion, heating and cooling, tree root wedging, burrowing actions of animals, salt crystallization, and there is also hydration. We were supposed to look at all of them, but due to time, we had time to only look at pressure release jointing and exfoliation. So you check now your homework. I ask you to do your notes on the two examples of physical or mechanical weathering that we covered yesterday, and that was on pressure release jointing. And as well as that, I ask you to do your notes on heating and cooling, construction or sketches of diagrams to show the process of exfoliation. You double check. Do you have your information done on those two examples of physical or mechanical weathering? Check your exercise book. Okay, if you have got that information, well done. If you did not get that information done, you will need to ensure that that information is done because it comes under the processes of denudation now, the first process, weathering. Today, we will continue on with looking at the other two examples which comes under physical and mechanical weathering, which are freezing and thawing, and also plant and animal action. Our task by the end of the lesson, at least you should be able to differentiate between those four examples of physical or mechanical weathering. And the four examples are pressure release jointing, heating and cooling, of which exfoliation comes in there as an example, freezing and thawing, of which I will touch on that today, and plant and animal action, of which I will also touch on today. Okay, so we look at the definition now given to what pressure release jointing is under the example of physical or mechanical weathering. But we also need to remember when we are dealing with physical or mechanical weathering, it is important for us to note that physical or mechanical weathering occurs when there is a stress or a strain which is exerted on a rock. And when that particular rock breaks up because of the stress and strain exerted on it, then we say physical or mechanical weathering has taken place. If there is no stress or strain exerted on the rock and the rock breaks up perhaps from other forces, then we can say there is no physical or mechanical weathering on that particular rock. It could be biotic or it could be chemical. And that's an important point you must remember on what physical or mechanical weathering is. Pressure release jointing, we've looked at that yesterday. From the information now on the monitor, it says there that deep in the crust of the earth, rocks are kept under pressure by the weight of the other rocks above. As the surface rocks are removed, pressure is gradually released, and the rocks which are under the surface, they expand and also split or break. And when that happens, this is an example of physical or mechanical weathering under pressure release jointing. Okay, we looked at an example, and the example there showed us the rock of granite. We all know from what we have covered already on volcanicity and rocks, granite is an intrusive igneous rock formed under the surface. If we look at this gray color here, the arrows indicating the pressure which is exerted on those rock of granite under the surface. Note there, as soon as the rocks on the surface are actually removed through the process of erosion and weathering, then the pressure or the weight is released on the rocks under the surface, resulting then in the splitting or the cracking or breaking up. And when that happens, we say physical or mechanical weathering has taken place, and that is an example of pressure release jointing. Okay, we also looked at heating and cooling. And in heating and cooling, I mentioned that rocks do not conduct heat very well. Only their outer surfaces expand in the heat of the day and contract during the coolness in the night. The surface cracking that results is referred to as exfoliation. And exfoliation is actually common in climatic areas such as where we have the deserts. In the desert, during the day, temperatures are very high. It's very hot. During the night, it gets very cold. And the difference in, or the large difference in the temperature can also contribute to expansion of the surface rocks during the day, contraction during the night, and the continuous expansion, contraction will result in the outer surface of the rocks peeling off or breaking off. And that then is, or that process then can be classified as an example of exfoliation. Okay, we had two photographs to show exfoliation. We note the surrounding or the environment, desert or semi-desert type environments. The second example is given there. We can see the peeling of the outer surface of the rocks. A sketch that you were supposed to have done for homework, had you done this work, then you would have something similar to this, whereby originally the dotted lines indicate the outer layer of the rock. Continuous contraction, expansion due to temperature variation or differences will mean the outer layer peeled off. And this now is the original surface or layer. Sorry, not the original. This now is the new layer. Given time, the continuous contraction and expansion will result then in this layer being peeled off, and this boulder here or the rock there getting smaller and smaller or breaking off in the process or with the process of exfoliation. I mentioned that the Americans also call this process onion skin weathering or onion weathering because it's just like an onion when it's growing. The brown onions or the onions, the round ones, when they are growing out of the outer cover. The process can be referred to or can be similar to what we are looking at on exfoliation. Okay, today maybe a little bit more information on exfoliation so we really understand the fact that rocks are not very good conductors of heat, or they do not conduct heat very well. There's another extra information that maybe we can look at on the sample of granite. If a rock of granite is actually lying exposed on the surface, we note that the rock itself, the rock of granite, has minerals of different colors inside that particular rock. Therefore, the darker minerals which are found within the rock of granite, they tend to absorb more heat. And therefore, because they can absorb more heat, they are likely to expand a little bit more, resulting in stress being created. So within rocks itself also, the colors of the different minerals can also contribute to the stress in the rock, resulting in it being able to break up quickly or not so quickly. Okay, and all of that information comes together with heating and cooling or exfoliation. Okay, now we move on to what I'd like us to look at for today, and that's the completion of the work on mechanical or physical weathering. And this time we look at the third example. And the third example is that of frost shattering or freezing and thawing. We know that water expands by about a tenth when it freezes. When the temperature falls below 0 degrees Celsius, ice crystals grow, and when they grow, they exert pressure, especially on the joints or the cracks or crevices. When they exert the pressure, then that's when splitting of the rocks may result or may take place. If we had to look at a diagram to illustrate that, we might have okay, we have a block here. Maybe we have a block of rock exposed. Water gets collected in the cracks. So this here representing cracks. Okay, the water gets to be collected in the crack here, which is in the rock itself. And then when the temperatures go below 0 degrees, what happens to the water? It freezes. And when it freezes, it expands, because we have found out that water, upon freezing, it expands by about 1/10. So here goes. It freezes. It takes up more space. You can see now the crack originally in the first diagram is small. And in the second diagram, it has expanded, or the crack has gone bigger or wider. And when that happens, we can see stress and strain exerted on this rock here, resulting in it breaking up. So when we're looking at freezing and thawing, this type of breaking down of rocks is actually common mainly in the temperate regions of the world. And also it is common in high altitude areas where temperatures go below freezing or 0, yes. Okay, so here we have an example, perhaps similar to what I've put up on the board. You have the joints here, of which rainwater trickles or gets collected into the joints. When temperature goes below freezing, the water then freezes or freezes, and then you end up having the ice being formed here, resulting then in those cracks you can see widening and deepening. So the cracks get to be widened, and they also get to be deepened. Okay, so when that happens, we say that is an example now of freezing and thawing under mechanical or physical weathering. Okay, so if we look at the other diagrams to show that, keep your eye on the cracks. Here, water gets collected in the cracks or joints in the rocks. And then note there the joints widen, and they also deepen due to frost shattering. Okay, and that's the third example. Any queries or questions with regards to this third example on freezing and thawing? No questions? Perhaps maybe if we look at another, a simple example to illustrate this type is when you fill up your containers with water and you fill it right up to the top of the container, then you put it into the deep freezer and you forget, or you leave it there till the next day. What happens when you go back to get your water if the container is filled right to the top? Yeah, the container cracks or it breaks, yes, definitely. That's because the water there expands, and upon expanding, it will take more space, resulting in the breaking or the cracking then of the container. The idea is similar to freezing and thawing. Okay, finally, the last example I'd like us to look at is that of plant and animal action. Some of you might be sitting down, but plants and animals should go with biotic or biological weathering. Here we are looking at their actions. The actions of plants and animals can also classify the type of weathering under physical or mechanical. When plants and animals, they exert stress or strain onto rocks, resulting in the rocks breaking, then we can say physical or mechanical weathering has actually taken place. But it is mainly because of the action of the plants or animals. Two good examples for us to look at will be the tree root wedging. When the trees are actually growing, the roots especially under the ground can also come into rocks and split them or crack them. Or you can have the burrowing action of animals. Some animals, they burrow, they dig. And while they are digging through, upon rocks, or when they come in contact with the rocks while they're digging, they can also cause stress and strain, resulting in the rocks breaking. Okay, let's look at some examples of physical weathering. Tree root wedging. You can see here the roots of the tree growing into the rocks, resulting also in their breaking up of those rocks. Look at this diagram here. We're looking at the outward force. When the roots are actually growing, the outward force is the one that contributes to the splitting or the cracking of the rocks of which the roots are growing into. Here is another example of tree root wedging. You can see here the cement slab here of which the tree growing has already cracked or split that particular rock. And finally, we look at burrowing action of animals. There is an animal which burrows. And while the particular animal is actually burrowing, it is also contributing to the breaking up of the rocks. Okay, some activities now for you to work on. We've got 4 activities. I'd like you to work on those 4 activities. I would like you to discuss and also have your answers written in your exercise book, and then we'll go through the correction of those answers before the end of the period. Okay, you have to explain with the help of well-labeled diagrams the process of freezing and thawing. I've already explained to you, I've shown you some examples. It is now your turn to actually construct your diagrams and also explain what is actually happening with those diagrams you construct. Number 2, describe how the actions of plants or animals can also be classified as physical or mechanical weathering. Number 3, where in Papua New Guinea would freezing and thawing be most likely to take place? And finally, number 4, describe the type of climate that physical weathering would most effectively take place in. Okay, you can discuss, especially for question 2, 3, and 4. You can discuss and then come up with your answers. Have your answers written in your exercise book. Okay, let's check. For the first one, you're supposed to explain with the help of well-labeled diagrams the process of freezing and thawing. Okay, if we go back to looking at the example on freezing and thawing, you should have at least 2 diagrams. The first diagram to show you the cracks or the joints or crevices on rocks. And note that in the first diagram, when you have constructed it, you must label that these indicate cracks or crevices in rocks especially. Then you note water gets to collect into those cracks or joints or crevices. So you check your diagram, it should be labeled. Then the second diagram, you should now show those cracks which have actually been widened, and the arrows to indicate the widening of the cracks, and also your arrow to indicate the deepening of the cracks. So in the first diagram, the cracks or the joints are small. The second diagram there, deepened and widened. And the widening and the deepening is as a result of frost shattering. Okay, you check, make corrections. Okay, let's look at question number 2. For question number 2, you're supposed to describe how the actions of plants or animals can also be classified as physical or mechanical weathering. Elsie, your answer for number 2. Your description for how the actions of plants or animals could also be classified as physical or mechanical weathering.
When plants and animals exert stress or strain on rocks, it's referred to as physical weathering.
Okay, very good. Would you like to also give at least the example or an example of their actions?
Tree root wedging and burrowing action.
Okay, very good. For this particular question, all you had to write down was, for as long as the plants and animals exert stress or strain on rocks, resulting in them breaking up, then we can classify them as physical or mechanical weathering. And the 2 examples you could use would be tree root wedging and the burrowing actions of animals. Question 3. Where in Papua New Guinea would freezing and thawing be most likely to take place? Christopher.
In the Highlands region.
Okay, very good. We're looking at the Highlands region, not the whole of the Highlands region, but we're looking at perhaps areas which are a little bit more higher in terms of the altitude. Maybe if we have to give a specific example, then perhaps we might say Mount Wilhelm would be a good example. whereby freezing and thawing could take place, because it is the highest point also in Papua New Guinea. Okay, and finally, describe the type of climate that physical weathering would most likely or would be most effective in terms of it taking place. What type of climate do you think physical weathering would most effectively take place in? Gideon, your answer.
In deserts.
Okay, very good. He's given us one type of climatic area that physical or mechanical weathering would be most common in, and that is in desert regions. Is that all? No. Where else? Kathy?
In temperate regions.
Okay, very good. We also have in temperate regions because we looked at freezing and thawing. So in desert areas, in the temperate regions, and also in countries which have higher altitude areas whereby temperatures can go well below freezing. So in any of those three regions, we can have those as an answer for question number 4. That will also bring us to the end of our lesson. Class, if you can stand up now. Okay, and to the pilot teachers, our keyword for lesson 63 is exfoliation. Good afternoon and thank you, students.